What's up, everybody? Welcome to CFP Talks episode number 28. Now, I don't, do we have a title for today,
I
David?
was literally, I was about to say we didn't discuss what athlete we were going to be naming this episode after.
But all right, then we don't. We're gonna call this the Gary episode because most importantly, as you can see,
Well,
we
well,
have a bright and shining, smiling face on the screen with us today. We are very fortunate to have Gary Clement with us today. And for those of you who don't know who Gary is, he is in our financial planning world known as a legend. The man has 15 sets of letters after his name. Let me read them off so everybody knows how gangster you are, Gary. CFP, CRPS, I think that's Certified Retirement Planning Specialist. Is that right?
mhm.
Okay. CRPC, AFC, MPAS. I mean, the guy's got more letters and designations than most of us have years in the industry. So thank you very much for being on the show. And for those of you who don't, again, know Gary has a lot of letters, but more importantly, he's got an incredible breadth of experience. He's been with Kaplan as an adjunct professor for the last 11 years. You teach at Clark University, you teach at Kennesaw State, and mainly those areas are in financial planning. So thank you for being on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Well, so where we wanted to start today is just kind of talking a little bit about the CFP, obviously. Uh, You've seen this exam change, and I took the exam back in 2008. David took the exam in 2021. When did you take the exam?
I took the exam in 2005,
Okay.
2006, actually.
Okay, so a couple years before me. So you were part of the 10-hour 2-day exam.
Yeah, it was a 10-hour 2-day exam, 4 hours on Friday, 2 3-hour sessions on Saturday. And that was back when it was paper and pencil.
Yeah,
And even worse than that, that was when you had to wait around 6 weeks to get your results. So it was 6 weeks of torture.
that was 6 weeks. I remember getting the letter at work and like flipping out. They also messed up they put my CFP number right on my paper, but it said like Dear Derek. I'm like, oh no, did I really pass this thing or not? So I was like freaking out when I got that. I remember calling. They're like, "Oh, we had a mail merge error." Like, what the heck? Who has? How do you?
Nobody checks these things, huh? Well,
So
I'll tell you, these days, you get that same experience, but it's condensed in about 5 to 10 seconds. I don't know whether it's more intense and more uncomfortable during that 5 to 10 seconds than it is waiting 6 to 8 weeks.
well,
Because some people are afraid when they finish the exam to even push
oh
the
yeah,
submit
Yeah.
button.
yeah. That moment where you hit the submit button is just the worst. So I just took CFA, and we had to wait 10 weeks
Mhm.
to get those results, and I honestly don't know what's worse. Like that. I think that waiting the 10 weeks was like you go through like the 7 stages of grief in those 10 weeks. You're like, oh, I definitely passed. Then a week later, you're like, I failed. And then the next week, you're like, I think I did all right. And then the next week, you're like, well, okay, let's start accepting this failure potential. That what happens? What am I going to do? And you go through a roller coaster. David was actually in a unique situation because he was part of the only group in 2021 that actually had to wait for their results.
I was about to say, even though I took it a year ago, so March 2022, and everybody's getting their results instantly now, we were literally the one cohort that had to wait. And the reason for that, Gary, it just in case you didn't know, I'm sure you do though, is they added behavioral finance to the exam, and I was the first cohort to take it when they added it in. So they had to give a little grace period so they could see, I guess, Joe, like how the questions they would integrate that subject into the exam. So we had to wait, even though we're part of, I guess, the modern CFP exam. And
Yeah.
um,
That same thing happens in CFP world. Anytime there's a major change, they go back to the old protocol in terms of the time it takes for you to get your test exam results. And I'm like Joe, I went through part 1, level 1 of CFA, so I had to wait those 8 weeks or so to get the result back. And it's tough, you know, when you think you're not confident about whether you passed or not, you have to make the decision. Do I continue to study?
Yeah.
Or do I just leave it alone for this time period and just wait for the results? So that's a tough consideration too, especially when you put in a lot of time to study the first go around.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's why I'm like, for me with CFP, I remember the month leading in, I was like, I'm not waiting around for 6 weeks to find that. I'm like, this is a one and done for me. That's it. Like I was like, there is no chance. I was like a robot studying. It was just such a robotic habitual thing. But let me ask you this, because I left the industry for a period of time. I left the financial planning in 2010, and my entrance back into the industry was probably about 2017, 2018. I started teaching finance a little bit. I had started doing some more CFA stuff earlier than that, but I didn't really dive back into the CFP world until that point. So I have a big gap in time that I didn't see the exam evolve. Clearly, that's not your experience. What do you think of the exam now that it's a 6-hour experience versus what we did at 10 hours? Is it a better exam? Is it a worse exam? Is it more applicative? We hear candidates saying that the math is starting to go away, the conceptual. What are your thoughts on how the exam has evolved?
Yeah, it's definitely morphed. I mean, it was 280 questions in the past. Now it's 180 questions. 2 days, 10 hours in the past. Now it's 6 hours on one day. So there's fewer questions. I don't think that the questions are any less difficult. But what I have seen is that the exam has started to trend towards the softer side of financial planning. So what students should learn about what we should or should not be doing as financial advisors.
Right.
What are the general things that we need to know about client communication and getting in that client's world? And then the new thing that they added was behavioral finance.
Right.
So this is really moving us away from the technical answers, although they're still important. What we know now is that if you can't motivate somebody to take action on the things that they said were important to them, then all the rest of the stuff is a waste of time.
Yeah.
So I think that is being recognized along with, the value that we bring is the value that human beings bring to any relationship. And that's not something that can be reproduced by any computer, any algorithm. And we really need to focus on getting in our clients' worlds. And that's really what the test is beginning to move towards. And I would expect that it's going to even move more towards that in the future.
Do you think that it's bad that there is less technical know-how? Because I remember, in teaching it now versus when I took it, our technical know-how, especially from an investment standpoint, I remember estate and tax being especially intense. Like I remember that part of our education program, and I did it through the American College, was we actually did multiple tax returns. Now that's an exercise that I'm going to start integrating back into some of my cohorts. Do you feel like that's a good thing that we're going more towards getting in our clients' worlds and focusing on the things that matter to them the most and maybe taking at the sacrifice of the technicals? Or do you feel like maybe some of that gets lost? We do still need that technical expertise and skill.
Yeah, I think we definitely still need the expertise and skill. And I don't think that even though we've gone in that direction towards the softer side of financial planning, I don't think that the reduction in the technical side has been so much that it's still not something that is really paramount that you got to know to pass the exam. When students are studying for the exam, one of the things that I try to make a point of is you can't ignore the softer side. I know it seems easy.
Mhm.
I know it seems like it's common sense. It's not always that,
That's right.
but they really want to focus on getting these technical concepts down. And just the process of studying all that stuff is valuable. Whether they've got 100 extra questions on it or not, I don't think is the point, because the questions are just as challenging as they were before.
Hmm.
There's just fewer of them. So I don't think it's a negative. I think it's a value add, and I think that students still have to be worried about and concerned about knowing all these technical things that, I mean, to be honest, they don't need to know after the exam, right?
Hmm.
But they do need to know for the exam. And if they're not clear on those things, that's the difference between a passing score and a failing score.
Yeah, I mean, and as the educator, and David can certainly attest to this, is that there's parts of your prep, and when David was part of my cohort, where you would go, why do we have to know this? This is so. I get it. I get it. Like my entire prep was expletive, 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 expletive. Why is this? Why do we? And I was just, of course, when you're going through it, it's a very different experience than now sitting here on the other side. Uh,
Mhm.
and to that end, what are you seeing? Like, you teach at a university level, so you get to be involved in the education process. And you also do study groups to actually take the exam. What do you think is the difference between the pass and the fail? The
Yeah,
student.
there's two things I always point out. There's two things that separate those that pass from those that fail. And it's the time that they put in, because a lot of times people underestimate the exam. They think it's like a FINRA exam or like a college exam. It's not. And it's hard to really get that across to people. This is not like anything that you've done before.
Right.
So you're going to have to put in a whole lot more effort than you might have before. So that's number one. They don't put in enough time, they don't put in enough effort. And I equate time and effort in with regards to hours as well as questions. So the board, they say that 250 hours is adequate. I don't think that that's adequate. It's got to be more than that. And we don't know what that number is for each person. If it
Right.
takes somebody 300 hours, it takes 300 hours. If it takes them 500 hours, it takes 500 hours. So a hard and fast rule is no good. It really is based on that particular person. And as far as
Yes.
questions, I'm of the mind that you got to do as many questions as possible. So 4,000, 5,000, all that stuff might seem like overkill, but I'm like you, Joe. When I went through this, it was a one-way trip.
I am right.
I was of the mind that I never want to do this again. So because of that, I'm going to do everything that is in my power that I can control
Hmm.
to prepare for
So,
the end,
so,
right?
so yeah, so Gary, so recently, it was either last week or the week before. I think it was last week. Joe and I, we had a whole episode dedicated to the Q Bank and just how to effectively use it, why people may use it the wrong way, which may lead them to not be successful. So you said one thing right there. You said take as many questions as possible. And my question, I guess, for you, just to add on to that is, do you, in your mind, is that start doing them right away? Or is that learn the material first and then kind of use the Q bank as a way to kind of measure where you're at in the process?
It's a little bit of both. I don't think that it's effective to go to the questions first. When somebody goes through the education process, that's sometimes a year and a half to 2 years for folks. So in the course of that time, towards the end of that time, you have forgotten a lot of stuff that you went through in the first few months. So it really is important to go back and make sure you got a good understanding before you go to questions. And at the same time, when you're doing questions, you can't lose sight of the material, because there are going to be concepts you know pretty well, some that you don't know very well. So it's going to be important to identify those areas and go back to the book whenever that's necessary. And the other thing is, everything counts, not just questions. So if somebody's got downtime and they've got flashcards or they got a manual and they can read for an hour, all of that counts. Nothing in terms of effort is wasted effort. And it really goes into how much time they actually put in. So that's a huge issue. That's a huge issue. The other reason why I say a lot of questions is there's only so many ways that these questions can be asked. And the major thing I tell folks is, hey, you got to go to the last sentence in that fact pattern, which is where the question is, and understand what they're actually asking you, because that'll inform whether you need all the information in the STEM, some of the information, what you can eliminate from your thinking in terms of answering the question. And it also help you hone in on the answer rather than go for one of those attractive distractors that they're going to have for you as well. So all of that stuff is important. But I got to go to number 2 in terms of why people don't pass the exam. Number 1, not enough effort. Don't take it seriously enough. Don't put enough time in. Number 2 is taking too long on any specific questions, or all of them for that matter. I always tell folks, you got 120 seconds. That's it. If you can't answer the question in 120 seconds, it's time to mark your favorite answer. And if you don't know, it's time to guess. And if you have no clue, it's when you punt on first down, right? You know that's not something you're going to get. Take a guess, mark it for review, come back. The whole idea is you want to take the easy test first. Get those questions answered where you're comfortable with the concept. Come back to the other ones later. And I like to use, getting back to basketball, I like to use my John Wooden quote that I love so much, which is be quick, but don't hurry. And if you do that by taking the easy test first, you're going to quickly get through those concepts you feel confident about, leaving yourself a lot of time to go through the ones that you're not that confident about. And that's, I think, a good way to go through the exam. I mean, the board wants people to waste time because when you're time constricted, you're going to be more anxious. You're going to tend to rush. You're going to misread questions. You're going to jump to conclusions and get questions wrong that you could have gotten right.
I also think that if you go through and, like, let's say on the first quartet of the exam, the first 42 questions, you go through and you answer all the ones that you're pretty confident about, and you basically skip over the ones that you are unsure of or have literally no idea, and leave them for the end, like you said, and leave a little bit of time at the end, assuming you have it. And this way, you're answering the questions that you got right, and you're leaving time for the ones at the end. If you do it the other way around and you take more time early on with the harder ones, you may run out of time and not get to the ones that you are probably going to get right.
Exactly.
So my rule of thumb was, on every single exam I've taken in the industry so far, Series 7, insurance, CFP, obviously, was if I didn't know it, I marked it and just skipped it right away. And answered the ones that I knew, and then just saved them up for the end. Like the hard ones for the end.
That's the perfect way to go through the exam. You know, the other thing that comes into play, the board is pesky. They're going to put a lot of those case studies at the beginning of one of those sessions. So they're going to tempt people to go through that case study in a whole lot of detail, waste a whole lot of time, and then be rushed on the remainder of the questions in that section of the exam. And there's nothing that stops people from moving past by just marking all the answers with something on a case and coming back to it and taking it on when they got plenty of time to focus on it.
Yeah, I'll mix out the caveat. I tell everybody, mark an answer. Don't ever leave anything unmarked. You got to mark an answer. Flag it for review, but come back. But I mean, it feels like, honestly, I just looked into a much more handsome mirror with everything you just said. I say this all the time, and I start to feel like I'm a little nuts. I'm like, man, what is it? Like, I'm hoping some of this stuff is sinking in. But I tell everybody the same thing, which is they all count the same.
They all count 2 points.
So, if they all count the same, so if you answer a hard question, it's more of an ego pat on the back than it is you got points, and our goal is to get points.
That's the point. Mhm.
Let me ask you this though, Gary. Do you think the CFP is an exam of fundamentals?
Yeah, I do. Because here's the deal. The CFP board is not testing for the maximum knowledge that it takes to be a financial planner.
I agree.
Testing for the minimum. And it is about foundational knowledge. Well, here's the other thing. The way the board has set up the topic areas, 65% of the exam is in 3 classes that people have had. The general principles class, the investment class, and the retirement class. And what are we dealing with as financial advisors most of the time? General stuff, investment planning, and retirement planning. That's 65% of the exam. Oftentimes we don't, unless we're in the business of doing estate planning, we don't mess with that, right? If we can have a high level conversation about that, that's great. If we don't do taxes on a regular basis, as long as, we can have a high level conversation about that, that's great.
Right.
All of the other stuff is stuff that is in the typical advisor's wheelhouse and should be. And that's why I think it's definitely a foundational exam.
I call it an exam of definitions.
Yeah.
Because I think if you know your definitions well, and this is what I emphasize is, and I emphasize flashcards from day one. That is part of us doing questions is we do flashcards very, very early on to build foundational definitions because you can't do the hard stuff without doing the easy stuff first.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
I've said it to David's cohort and I like to the point where they're like, all right, we get it. You love flashcards. You're like in love with the. It's not the point. Is that those flashcards really work because they build those foundational definitions. You see it over and over again, and now you're starting to get something where the answers start to become more apparent. And I have this. I always give this conversation right before we start doing mocks. It's the last month of prep, and we talk about. In basketball, we say 50-50 balls, right? The possessions that go to one team that could have ended up in the other team. Well, I call them 50-50 questions. Those 50-50 questions that a lot of people say, I brought it down to 2 answers. I just didn't get the right one. And I always tell people, I said, that's because you didn't know the definition. Because if you know the definition, there's very few 50-50 balls, right? Not
I agree with that.
It's the exam.
I'd have to agree with that. And that's part of the reason, David, why I said you got to be really closely tied to the book early on. And then I use that as in the same way that you use flashcards.
Mhm.
Look, Joe, I've been writing test questions for the board for the last 6 years also.
Yeah.
So I can tell you that the board looks at questions based on Bloom's taxonomy. First level questions are awareness questions. That's, do you know what X is? Do you know what Y is? You're not going to get any questions on that, on those types of questions on a board exam. Next level is analysis. Next level is evaluation. Highest level is application. But here's the thing. If you don't have a strong enough base of knowledge, you don't have a shot at the analysis questions, the evaluation questions, or the application questions.
Right.
And like Joe, like you're just saying, if you know enough as you're reading the question, before you even get to the last sentence where the actual question resides, concepts are going to jump out at you.
Yeah.
That's what you want. That's what you want. You want to know the concepts that they're bringing up in the STEM so well that you have a clue around what the question is going to be about.
And I like that you brought that up because I literally was just writing my learning thesis on my website. I actually didn't know that this is actually really interesting because I didn't know that the board actually uses that. And I explain, I about 2 years ago, I started talking to people from LA Unified who run the school districts here in Los Angeles. And I said, I am not an educator by trade. I'm an educator by fire, right? I learn most of the way that I've learned how to teach is because you do something with a student and it works, and you do something with a student and it doesn't work. And after a couple of years of doing that and 10,000 hours of teaching, you go, okay, I know what. And so I said, look, I need you to start helping me put this together. And they introduced me to Bloom's taxonomy. For those of you who don't understand what this is a learning methodology that is highly accepted and highly used around the United States of how people learn and observe concepts. It's very apparent with children, but as adults, we don't do this. The natural way that we learn as adults is we think, well, I'm gonna read something and then I'm gonna go do it. And it's like trying to learn how to fix your toilet off of YouTube.
Yeah.
You end up calling the plumber. So don't do it, right? But the basic taxonomy is that you need to know that there's knowledge of a concept first, and then be able to recall it before you can understand it, before you can apply it. And that analysis stage is taking that application and changing the context, which I believe CFP really loves because they say, oh, you understand capital gains? Well, what about now? Oh, you understand it there? Okay, what about now? How about now? How about now? And that seems to be the way that they do things. And especially you see this when I talk to students after, I say, was the mock exam representative? And they say, yes, in the way that they ask questions, but not necessarily in the same exact concepts. But it's the same thing. It's like they pull the rug out, and everybody's like, I feel like the rug got pulled out from underneath me because they changed the concept.
And it's all about the concept, and it's all about the context.
Yeah.
Right. So they'll change the context to see if you know the content.
Yes, I agree with
And
that.
that's the thing that's so tough. And this gets back to, point number one around why people fail the exam. If you don't put in enough time, there's no way you're going to know the concepts well enough. You're not going to have that foundational knowledge set. And there's no way that you can take the little bit that you do know out of the original context in which it was presented to you and apply it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So,
Do you think that more students get caught up in that apply and analysis phase, or do you think it's the remember and understand? Because
it's definitely people are intimidated by the breadth of information, right? And it's hard for them to conceive that, they're going to remember all this stuff. And this gets back to point number one, right? You got to put in the time. And you got to just repeat it over and over again. So when people hear from me that, you got to start out going back to page one and day one and go through that. And when you're done with that, you got to go back to page one and day one. And maybe you have to do that 4 or 5 times, maybe 6 or 7 times.
Who is it?
The thing is, repetition is the mother of retention.
That's right.
You gotta do it. There's no other way. But here's the thing that I promise folks. Every time you go over it, this mountain of information is going to seem like less and less and less.
He's a more handsome mirror, man. This is the best thing I've ever heard. It's so nice to hear another. But it's funny because David said the same thing when we were chatting about this last week, because it might have been last week or 2 weeks ago when you said like the first time you took it, you had went to a wedding a couple weeks before, you'd like, and I've had a student who recently, and they came out of the exam, they were a bit disappointed that they failed. I said, well, all right, where were you 2 weeks before the exam? I went skiing that weekend. I said, there it is. That was attitude throughout the entire exam period, was that this was a secondary thing.
Yeah.
And if work was, if you're going to work till 7 or 8 o'clock every night, there's nothing wrong with that. You can work till 7 or 8 o'clock, but you shouldn't then be trying to take the exam because it's not going to work.
Yeah.
You're not going to
no
that you need.
Yeah, I agree.
For sure.
One of the things I tell folks is for this next 3 months, this is the only thing. So the things that you might have wanted to watch on TV, we all have the ability to watch it later on. That's not something that you have to watch. As far as family, it's time at the beginning of that process to negotiate with family and let them know that those things that you might have been available for, you're not going to be available for. But, there lies an opportunity too, because during that negotiation process, you got to make it clear that with family, this is not just an individual accomplishment, it's a family
Yeah.
accomplishment that's going to benefit everyone in the family. So
Yeah.
to negotiate away some of the time that you'd spend with them, but also to negotiate in assistance is vital. Whether it's something you used to do but you can't do and somebody else takes over, or whether somebody's helping you with flashcards. These are all things that help.
Yeah,
And
I
not just that.
go
Well, I
ahead.
was gonna say not just that, but it's also when you're going through this and maybe you're staying up late studying, you are studying on a Saturday, or you're just generally going to be worn down, because if you're doing it the right way, which is, you're dedicating yourself for the 3 or 4 months, you're going to get to that point, which if you're with a significant other, like I was living with my girlfriend, who's now my fiance, and I know Joe
Only because he
was,
passed the exam.
yeah, right, exactly.
Unless you have those CFP,
Yeah, she's like, no, you're moving out. But they go through it too.
yeah.
Yes.
Because I know if you haven't gone through the process yet and you're listening to this and you may not have gone through it, it may sound foreign, but if you're living with someone, whether it's a roommate or you're living with your parents or your significant other, they're going through it too. And I always tell Alex this. I'm always like, we both passed the exam.
Exactly.
You were just as much a part of it, because there were a lot of things that I couldn't do. Walk the dog, do the laundry, cook dinner. And that's all part of the whole process if you're going to be dedicated to it. So, it is a team effort.
It's
Yeah.
absolutely a team effort. I tell folks after they pass, make sure to give your kids an extra hug.
Yeah.
Those times that you couldn't spend that time doing that, make sure you take the spouse out, have a good time, celebrate as a family, because it is a family accomplishment.
For
And
sure.
here's the other thing that you kind of alluded to that I feel compelled to touch on. And this gets into some of the other things we talked about too. When you're studying for the exam, you're really training your mind and your body. So I always say you got to study for 3, maybe 4 hours a night during the week, maybe a little bit more on the weekends, because you're training yourself to focus for 3 hours, which is what you're going to have to do on the exam. The major point is you don't want the first time that you have to sit and focus for 2, 3 hour stretches to be when you're in the exam and all of the marbles are on the table. So you got to be in a situation when you go in and take the exam as though you're doing this like you've done it multiple times in the past. It's just another session where you're sitting and doing this for 3 hours.
That's right. Just another day at the office is what I tell them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just another day at the office. But if you don't do that, if you don't prepare that diligently, then you're going to be one of those folks who goes in and after, I studied an hour here, an hour there. Well, what's going to happen when you're an hour and a half in the exam?
Yeah.
You're tired, you're going to lose focus, and all of that is going to bode poorly for passing the exam.
Well, I say this all the time. I say and I do exam prep as a living. So I see this across not just CFP, but I see it across FINRA exams and ASAA exams. The CFA is that most of us are overcommitted. And I'll give you an example. I had somebody who came to me in November, said, I want to take the Series 7 in 6 weeks. I said, okay. How much of the book have you read? None. But I really I said, okay, all right, I get it. You're really dedicated. All right, so how many hours? I'm going to study 4 hours a night. Okay. All right. We started on roughly December 1st. His pre-work assignment was to have 5 chapters of the book read. So we would work on 15 chapters together. We started, that was now 3.5 months ago. We are just finishing the book.
Yeah.
And I said to him, and so we're just finishing the book. Now the exam should have been taken 6 weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
but we didn't even come close because everybody has this idea, the rush job. I want to rush through this. I just want to get in and knock it out. And it's kind of a really defeating mindset that I'm going
It
to
is.
and knock it out because this is a career exam. And I understand there's certain things that you're not going to use, but if you go in with that mindset, it is a roller coaster mindset because that's
It
the
is.
hour here, an hour there. It's not a trained habit that we're doing day in and day out. And, this is a marathon. So,
Exactly.
you can't treat the marathon like you're going to train for a 1 mile run.
Exactly. You know what I say about that?
Yeah.
I say to folks, motivation sucks.
Hmm.
Everybody is motivated on day one. Everyone. But that's not what does it in terms of getting you ready for any of these exams. It's
Right.
really consistency of effort during the times when you're motivated to do it, and even more importantly, the times when you're not motivated to do it. You just got to push through. So motivation alone gets people started, but it doesn't get them through the process, and it certainly doesn't get them across the finish line. So that's hard to explain to folks also.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult. And here's the thing, I tell folks also, look, I know that there's going to be plenty of times that you don't want to study. Let's just say it's a given. There's going to be something on TV. You're going to want to go to the movies. You're going to want to rest. You're going to want to go on a walk or bike ride. You're going to want to do other things. But I assert this, that when you're thinking about all of these other things and you're having difficulty studying, that you're thinking about studying as an obligation and not an opportunity. So when we reorder thinking and show that the opportunity is you can have this certification. In the case of CFP, you've got the gold standard in financial planning, you're stamped as an expert in the field, all these other great things. And the same things goes for licensing exams. If you focus on the opportunity, then it's easier to get through those times when it's difficult to study, as opposed to the drudgery involved when you're thinking about it as an obligation. So it's something that you get to do as opposed to something that you gotta do.
I said this a few weeks ago. I think it was one of my golden nuggets, Joe. But one thing that I would do going through the process, and obviously you get burnt out, you get frustrated, you get to the points where you don't want to study because you want to watch a Netflix show, whatever it is. What pushed me through is I always envisioned, well, mine wasn't clicking at the grade, but just for argument's sake, clicking the button, getting the passing grade, and getting the letters, and just like imagining that feeling, passing it, and imagining being able to call your parents and call your boss and call your girlfriend or boyfriend or whoever, and be able to tell them that you passed. And that was always what pushed me through. And I always say, and I tell this to Joe, I said this to Joe, I tell him all the time, having something to look forward to after, and also looking forward to that feeling, always pushed me through at those tough times.
I'm gonna tell you, this is a crass analogy, and I tell folks, I don't know what dope is like, but if it's anything like putting in the effort it takes to pass an exam like this and get that rush of euphoria that comes along with accomplishing something that took a superhuman effort for you to accomplish and prepare for it and accomplish, there's not a real better feeling than that.
Yeah.
So, I hate to use that kind of crass analogy, but if dope is like
crass,
this,
we're an R-rated show. We're NC-17.
Well, I was gonna actually, my question was gonna be, what kind of dope are you talking about?
if it's better than that, I don't want it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good analogy because, like a lot of people, they get overtaken by emotion the moment they see the pass.
Exactly.
David was overtaken with when I passed level 3, it was probably the third time in my life that I actually like cried because that was 2 years of
Mhm.
grinding. It
Well,
was
I'll tell you,
top.
when I passed the CFP exam, when I finally, after that 8 weeks, got the pass result, that was only the second time that I ever cried.
Yeah. It's a great feeling. There's nothing better than knowing that it was you. I put in the work. Like there was like, I say this, they say this in the NBA, but I've stolen it, right? Ball don't lie. The CFP
Right.
doesn't lie, right? It doesn't matter who your daddy is or your mommy is, how rich you are, how poor everybody goes in and takes the exam and you have to pass it. And to me, there was nothing better than that because, you know, I had to put in the work. There's nobody that I could depend on. I had to put in the work. Granted, there was a huge cast of people that you have to thank out, like my friends, my family, my sister, like all the people who were like, hey, I know you're studying this weekend. Let me send you some food. And I was like, man,
Yeah.
that's like the nicest thing ever. Like you have no idea how much I needed that. Like the thought of actually, like going and trying to cook a meal after like a long study day is just, but
Right.
nobody could take that away from me. There was nobody could take the CFP away from me. And I think that's truly, it's one of the best moments. But, we say, that there's nothing magical about this process.
No secret sauce.
There's no secret sauce. It's discipline over motivation. The discipline, and actually it's funny you bring that up because David and I was messaging, we were texting on Monday, and I said, hey, I want to do an episode on mental toughness, and we're going to probably do that in the next couple of weeks because the reality of it is that what we're seeing, what I'm seeing, uh, is we get a lot of smart people in my classes, bright people who went to really prestigious universities, did well at those prestigious universities, graduated with honors. Why doesn't that necessarily translate that to an automatic grade on the CFP? Because this exam is more of a mental grind than it is a grind of intelligence.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. And
well,
the other thing is those with prestigious backgrounds, educational backgrounds, are the ones that tend to underestimate the exam.
bingo.
They've been able to get really good grades without, maximum effort because of sheer intellectual talent. Well, this test does not test you on sheer intellectual talent.
That's right. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's a great place to end. Let's kind of close this up here, and I want to get your take on where do you think the CFP is going? You alluded to this earlier. I think I know where what I see, and I tend to always want to hold the contrarian view. I never really like what anybody. I tend to like what the CFP board is doing, although I have one huge gripe with them, and I'll tell you that in a second. I like what the industry is doing in terms of how they're making this more of a behavioral job because I always felt as a producing FA that my job was 70% relationship driven and 30% technical.
Right.
Um, but where do you see the future of the exam going and how is it prepping people for the future? And then secondly, why do you think the CFP won't release its own material and actually set a standard versus forcing us as educators to like say go to Dalton or go to Denko or go to Zahn or like I wish every time I email them like, hey, what is this? Like I'm getting 4 different answers from 4 different providers. Why do you think CFP won't do that? More importantly, where do you see the industry going?
Okay, let me go with the latter question first.
Hmm.
I think that the CFP is focused on their major asset, and their major asset is the exam. That's number one. Number two, you know, seeing how the sausage gets made at Kaplan College for Financial Planning, I can tell you this. It takes a tremendous amount of work and effort to put together materials, to make sure that they're up to date, to make sure that there's no errors. It's a Herculean task. Some entities do it better than others, but if the CFP board was doing that, I think that it would not democratize the education process enough. So I like the idea that there are other education providers. Of course, you mentioned the businesses, Kaplan, Dalton, John, Danko, Biff, all of those folks. But then all of the universities are doing it, and they're free to do what they choose in order to meet the board standards with regards to the principal knowledge topics that have to be covered. So there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat. I like the idea that they don't care about that and they focus on, hey, this is our asset. If you can pass this, you're good to go.
Okay,
Rather than,
but doesn't that leave ambiguity in the interpretation of the material? Because, like, I'll give you an example. We were talking about an inflation adjusted returns the other day. Dalton has it one way, Biff had it another way, Danko had it another way, and I'm like, well, which one? What do I tell my students?
whichever way works for them, as long as it results in the right answer.
But the thing is that's the tough part, is that I feel like it leaves ambiguity where,
It
you know,
does.
an institute like the CFA Institute who puts out their own material.
But let's think about it this way also. When you're in practice, somebody comes to you with a specific situation, there's a lot of different ways to meet that client's objectives or help them meet their objectives. So
Correct.
there's not one way to do any of this stuff. So I like the idea that there's different ways that this is presented.
I agree with you on that, but on the flip side, I also disagree with you because as a student, you have to get to an answer. So
Yeah.
one says you subtract and one says you divide, and the CFP board has both of those answers, you're kind of screwed. And that's,
If it results in a different answer, yes.
you know,
But
that's my issue. I'm like, I wish they would set board standards, even if it was just on certain metrics, and give some guidance to that. Like, because again, different interpretations from different providers, which ends up making our lives as educators a bit more difficult. But, you know, I end up having, what I do is I just teach it both ways. If there's multiple ways, you know, but again, now that's a lot of extra work for us, but, and I wish they would, but all right, more importantly.
I don't do that. I tell them, look, this is the way I do it. This is the way you should learn it. And if they ask why, I say,
Because
I said so.
Yeah.
Man, you just doubted them off right there. You're like,
That's right. You know, and that comes up when we talk about, you know, let's say the 3-step method to figuring out retirement funds or college funding, right? Some people say do it with the uneven cash flow keys. Some people say do it with the 3-step method and walk your way through it. I'm a proponent of doing the 3-step method because it's intuitive. You can walk your way through it. You have to memorize keystrokes with the uneven cash flow method. And although you could do it that way, I don't know that it's the most effective way. So I just try to do how I think it should be done in the way that's most streamlined for most people. But I got to get to that first part of the question.
yes.
The first part of the question was, where do I think this business is going and whether the CFP board is meeting that. And I think the business is going towards behavioral finance. I'm surprised that it's taken this long
I
to
agree.
get to this point.
I agree.
Because I know a lot of us have gotten into this business really wanting to help people. And this is no different than, let's say, losing weight. We know there's a formula to losing weight. We can figure that out. That's not the issue. The issue is, are people going to do what's necessary to lose weight? So it gets back to what I said before. You know, that last piece of the financial planning process, motivate, could just as easily be monitor could just as easily be motivate. Because if you can't motivate somebody, then all the rest of it is a waste of time. So the thing that's great about behavioral finance is the stuff that we did not acknowledge is the stuff that's most important.
Mm.
So people don't know that they're being influenced by biases. People don't know that they may be influenced by money scripts or money disorders. Now, I know I've not defined that for folks that are out there listening, but they should think about that, because if I can, as an advisor, because of my experience and knowledge in behavioral finance, see that somebody is making suboptimal decisions based on what could be very predictable kind of behavior, then just having awareness of that can help somebody get over that.
Mm.
Some things we can't help them get over, and we can manage that. But to the degree that we can identify those things and help people get away from that, that's important. The other thing is, people are walking around here with trauma, financial trauma,
Mm.
that is unrecognized. And how does that impact them when it comes down to making financial decisions? Or maybe somebody is using their purchasing power to purchase things to bolster their self-esteem. All of these things don't bode well for making good financial decisions that are going to be life-changing. So anybody can figure out the technical stuff, if given enough work and time, right?
I agree with that. I think that we're definitely seeing it move that way. And I think it is more because I grew up on a roller coaster financially. And that's the reason I ended up in financial services, was because it was my own therapeutic way of trying to figure out how to not repeat the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's two things that the two most intimate things that people have are their health and their wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to help somebody lose weight or helping them save money is the same thing in terms of the process. Is that I think intuitively we understand that I got to make more money than I spend, and I got to eat, I got to burn more calories than I eat. I think those are two very obvious things for most of us.
Exactly.
Getting that adherence or having a conversation to get somebody to do that is a really hard thing to do, because more often than not, I used to have a partner who would say, I wish clients would just get out of the way and let us do our jobs, because they end up blowing up themselves more often than not. Like, and
Exactly.
we would have that conversation where, I would have this conversation with a lot of people, I'd say, and it was really great when somebody had a hobby that we could relate it to. I had this client that I remember was just terrified of the stock market, and she was a runner.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, when you feel bad, you still go out for a run? She goes, of course. So why do you do that? And she goes, because that's part of the plan. I said, exactly,
Exactly.
exactly. And ours is no different. Sometimes it feels bad to go out for a run. You still do it.
Exactly. And it's all of this is more about discipline. The world belongs to those people that are disciplined.
I agree.
And those people that are not disciplined, we know that there's a lot of them. And unfortunately, they don't get the same results because they're not doing the right things and doing them consistently enough. So, yeah, this stuff is the technical stuff. Certainly we can drill down into finite details, but on a high level, like you were saying, this is not rocket science. You spend less than you have coming in. If you can't save in this society, you're not going to make it. You convert your savings to investments that make sense. You shouldn't invest in anything that you don't understand. You should also know what you want to accomplish, because if you don't measure something, there's no way that you can manage it. So if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, you're not going to hit it. So it's an old proverb that says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there.
Yeah, Wizard of Oz, huh?
Exactly. So it's just getting people to acknowledge, recognize, and see that this is something that is important. Is important. So here's where we're going. We're going to a coaching and counseling model, right? It's not enough for somebody to know what they need to do, they need to have constant accountability, which is what you do, right? It's accountability factor.
All day.
They have to consistently do the things that we know work. And the great thing about coaches is coaches can see things that the players cannot.
Mm.
And that's based on experience.
Yeah.
And then you gotta trust your coaches, right?
Right. I mean, it's simple, but it's not easy, right?
It's simple, but it's not easy. Exactly. Exactly.
We will end on that note. So Gary, thank you so much for being here. David and I really appreciate having you on and connecting, and we would love to have you on again because there's 10 things we talked about today that could be their own episode. And
yeah, anytime, just let me know. It's been my pleasure, always a pleasure.
We definitely talk more about that counseling piece because I tend to agree. I think this is going in a direction where I used to say this about my weightlifting coach. I used to compete in weightlifting. I'd say, to be honest, you're a great coach, but you're a better psychologist because what you were able to get me to do was, the technical part was great, but the fact that you got me to perform at a certain level was more so of, it was built on that trust that I had in him and that what he saw in me, I could actually go and do. And I think that's really where this is becoming. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine today who was asking me about, he met with two financial advisors. And he said to me, "You're the first person that put this in English. We trust you."
Yep. That's really what it gets down to.
I was like, "Where do I send the bill, man?"
Yeah. That's what it comes down to. Here's the other thing that's part and parcel of coaching. A lot of people come to me, and they just, they doubt. They doubt what they can accomplish. They doubt if they got the time. They doubt if they're gonna have a good result. But the job of a coach, in my estimation, is to stand in that space of belief for that person who does not quite believe in themselves until they can believe it. And sometimes they don't believe it until they actually get the result. But standing in that space to tell people, yes, you can, when all their internal voices are telling them, no, you can't.
Preach. We'll end on that note. Ladies and gentlemen, the legend. This is why we said at the beginning of the episode, he's a legend, man. I feel like I just got schooled today.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, I said Gary Clement. Thank you, Gary, for being on. And we will see
Joe, David, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We will see you guys next week.